Here is a lady with a great love of books. Please welcome Anne Camacho.
Close teacher friend of mine who had said to me often, I don't know how you can teach that stuff. Literature is so depressing. And I said, I know, I love it. And she said, why do you like it? I said, because it reminds me that my life isn't so bad. And it actually reminds me that I'm not alone going through this journey. And I like that. You know, when I read novels and when I teach novels with my students, I share with them that they get to go through this experience without having to suffer consequences. You know, when we read about Hester Prynne standing on the scaffold in The Scarlet Letter in front of a town that's absolutely outraged with her, we get to understand what that feels like without having to experience it. We get to understand what it feels like to have so much curiosity and angst and pain in Crime and Punishment that we are obsessed with killing somebody. We watch someone go through that process. We watch them after that has taken place. But we don't have to go to prison. I don't know about you. I know orange is the new black, but it is not my color. And I don't want to experience some of these things. And I'm grateful that literature gives me that. It gives me validation. When I transferred to Penn State, I was in an advanced class for English students who were doing their dissertations. And so I was very quiet initially, and everybody in the class was quiet initially, and I believed that that was the proper way to sit in class. But we were reading these books, and I couldn't stop talking about them. So the professor would ask questions, and nobody would raise their hand, and I started to raise my hand. And then the professor would continue talking and asking questions, and nobody raised their hand. And I just kept raising my hand, and after a few weeks, I didn't even raise my hand. The professor just called on me. And I'm sure I was that student that the rest of the class said, oh, I hope she doesn't ask a question right before the end of class. And so the end of the semester comes, and I get my blue book, and I fill it out, and I spend at least an hour and a half to 2 hours making sure that all of my sentences are structurally correct and that I'm brilliant. And I give my professor the blue book, and he takes it and holds it up, and he writes an A on it and puts it in a pile. And I said, aren't you going to read it? And he said, you and I have been talking about literature all semester. I know what you think. I know that you've read. I know the connections that you've made. I walked out of the room and I did a cartwheel. I was really excited. And you know, Charlie in Perks of Being a Wallflower experiences that. He experiences finding his voice through the other characters in literature. And he's able to bring some pretty dark secrets to light. And literature can give us that context for conversation about some pretty difficult things that are hard to talk about. As far as direction goes, literature has played a huge part in my life. I have a 6-year-old daughter, Scout, and she plays in the backyard and she talks to herself all the time. And my 12-year-old looks at me and we smile and my 12-year-old rolls her eyes. But I recognize that because I used to do that. I used to go out into another world and play. And my mother would tell me a story about how I would set up a chalkboard, which is an old-fashioned whiteboard for those of you that don't know that. And I would set up a chalkboard and I would organize my stuffed animals in front of the chalkboard, and I would walk back and forth and I would lecture to my stuffed animals. And they were a very attentive audience, I must say. And my mother told me that story and said, you know, this is just what you did. So I got my degree in lit. And I called my mom and I said, all right, now what do I do? And she said, why don't you come back and get a master's in secondary ed, and if you don't like it, you don't have to do it. You have a master's. My mom always said, no one can take away your education, and see what that feels like. Most of the time, I've noticed that my parents have gotten smarter as I've gotten older. And in this case, she was right on. And I took one step in that classroom, and I knew that that was my home. And because literature has helped me find my voice, I've spent the last 20 plus years using literature to help my students find their voice. I asked them to look for connections between life and literature, but I also help them see the connections between life and literature because I believe literature is everywhere. I believe it's out in life. And I tell my students that books are a mirror. They're a mirror of society. They're a mirror of ourselves. They help us see who we are, sometimes who we don't want to be. And often they give us the catalyst for change, an opportunity to change and grow. A few years ago, in my book club, we were reading This I Believe. And This I Believe is a compilation of essays written by famous and not so famous people. And it was based on the 1950s Edward Murrow show called This I Believe, in which people had about 3 minutes to stand up and share anything that they thought was relevant and important. It was like kind of a first version of the TED Talk. They got 3 minutes and we get 18 today, so apparently we have more to share. But the book was fascinating, and I thought, oh my gosh, my students can totally do this. My students have this wisdom, they have this insight, they have these stories. And I've worked really hard on coming up with ways to integrate literature into my students' lives and into the projects that we do in my class. And so I thought, okay, how can I connect this with literature? And I asked my students to take a quote from any book that they had read, from kindergarten to college, and to anchor their life philosophy in that quote. And I went a step further because I said, my current students are amazing and wonderful, but my former students are amazing and wonderful. And so I sent out emails to them and I said, would you write an essay for me? And I got a couple of email responses like, are you kidding me? I'm not in your class anymore and you're still asking me to write an essay for you. But over a period of 6 months, I had a collection of 70 essays that were connected and wise and insightful and amazing. And with a couple of students who I'm going to share about today, Adam and Jessica, we sat down together and put into a collection, a manuscript that we sent in to a publisher. And that manuscript was accepted and published in 2012. And my students' voices are out there. They're out there in the world as they've found their way. I'd like to share with you about 3 of those students and their essays. The first one I'd like to talk about is a student, Adam, who almost from the beginning, when we were reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, was frustrated. He was frustrated with Huck, the protagonist, because Huck flip-flopped back and forth between who he hung out with and what he thought and what he liked, and Huck was a bit of a troubled young man who came from a tough home, and he kind of tended to want to avoid conflict, and so he would move from situation to situation, and he would change, and it was frustrating for Adam to watch this. Huck hung out with a boy named Tom Sawyer, and he went along with him, and then he kind of ran away from society, as we often want to do, and he got on a raft, and he was friends with the runaway slave Jim, and he hung out with him, and then when he met up with Tom again, he totally dumped his friend. He told Tom, any way that suits you suits me. And I could see the light bulb moment in Adam's face when he said in his book, I have spent, and it's been my perpetual endeavor to make people happy. I have ended up sacrificing my individuality and my personality at the cost of my integrity for others' approval. And he wrote about making a decision and realizing that at some point he could continue to live other people's lives, and he could continue to answer to them, and he could continue to say to them, anything that works for you works for me, or he could start living his own life. Jessica had a different experience. Jessica went back 3 years earlier, and she revisited a play that she had read in 9th grade, which is a play that most of us have read in 9th grade. In fact, we've been doing it for so long that I read the play in 9th grade, William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And Jessica shares right off the bat that Juliet was an idiot. She was a dumb, in Jessica's words. And she was disgusted with this young couple who, after a day and a half, realized that they were soulmates and they needed to get married. And she saw nothing but frivolity. She decided that at that point, young love didn't exist. And she reflects on how gentle and generous life is, that it gives us opportunity for learning and humility. And 3 years later, Jessica fell in love. And she was overwhelmed with the formative and powerful experience of that connection between herself and another. And she was almost embarrassed. She almost didn't like who literature was showing her she was. She didn't want to be connected to Juliet. But then she noticed a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. And she writes that love on any terms, at any age, and by whatever you want to call it, it's still love. It's still love that's worthy of being celebrated. And even though she notes that adults make a big deal about young love and puppy love, she reflects, adults aren't doing a great job at it all the time. And that ultimately, the ability to love is what exists and what she was able to embrace. I'm going to divert for just a moment and talk to you about a recent study that was released that I was very excited about by Kidd and Castano. They acknowledge that reading literary fiction enhances our ability to read other people's thoughts and actions. And as a lit teacher, this is very exciting to me because I feel like saying, see, I was right. This is important. This is good. You need to read. And I agree that reading increases our ability to gain empathy, as NPR says, to gain empathy and compassion for those around us. I do want to add to their theory. I believe that we need to take it a step further, and I share with my students that reading and talking and writing and reflecting on literature is so valuable. And then there's another step. It's finding your courage to act on the wisdom that you found in those books. And so John, the third student I'd like to share with you, found his direction in William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. John turned in an essay to me, and I was excited to get any of the essays, and so I started reading his immediately. And I was reading it, and at the very beginning, he said, "Words are no good." And I said, John, this is about how words are really good. Words are everything. And he said, "Keep reading, Miss Camacho." And in his essay, he shared with me how his parents had told him year after year, "We're going to stop gambling. We're going to stop moving. We're not going to live in these motels. We're not going to move from apartment to apartment. We're going to have a home." And those words were empty. They were empty promises. And so to John, he writes that words are no good. They mean nothing without the intent to act upon them. That I will shape a better future, not because of what I say, but because of what I do. John knew that the only way out of this vicious cycle that he had watched his parents go through was action. And he knew that his action was going to college. And so he took this same essay and he sent it in as a supplemental essay to gain entrance into UCLA. And in the fall of 2010, he was accepted in as a freshman. But John continued to act. And I'm so delighted and proud to share with you that this past spring of 2013, John Giannino was elected as the student body president of UCLA. Not because of anything he said, but because of what he did. So, my students, as a whole, are amazing and wonderful, and it wasn't always like that. Because lots of times I have had kids come forward and say, "Miss Camacho, why do we read? After all, you are acting like these books are real. You're acting like these characters exist. It's a book. They're fake." And I share with them, they're not. We have Hester Prynne's walking around who are ostracized, who are left out because of a mistake, a human mistake that they made. We have Huck Finns who don't know where they belong, in which society and where they fit. We have Juliets who fall in love, and whether it's they're filling up a hole from their past or not, we have characters around us, and sometimes even within us, that exist and that are real. I did the assignment, and I wrote an essay. And my anchor quote was from C.S. Lewis, in which he notes, "We read to know we're not alone." And I hold that to be true. We read to know we're not alone. I believe that reading gives us permission to own our humanity. Reading gives us validation and tells us it's okay to feel and think and experience what we're going through. And if we find the courage, reading can give us a direction. I will leave you with 3 things that I tell my students, and my students would concur if they were sitting here. I say to my students, get out a piece of paper, and I tell them to write and to write and to write. I share with my students the answers in the book. I say, go back to the book. Anchor your writing, anchor your text in what you've read. And the last thing I tell them is let books in. Let books into your heart. Let books into your mind. Let books into your soul. Let books leave a mark on your life so that you can go out and leave a mark on this world.